He was a lonely millionaire, surrounded by luxury but unable to create life. He seduced the young and fragile nanny out of sheer boredom and a need for control. 9 months later, she returned with a baby in her arms and eyes full of pain. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. We continue. The rain struck against the windows of the Wellington mansion like impatient fingers, creating a monotonous rhythm that echoed through the empty hallways. Ethan observed the storm from the study on the second floor, his hands resting on the windowsill, the muscles of his back tense beneath his white linen shirt. At 38, he had learned to love the silence of the house when rain muffled the noises of the city. It was in moments like these that he managed to forget, if only for a few minutes, the weight of the surname he carried. The mansion in Highland Park was a mausoleum of marble and secrets. Each room held memories he preferred buried. The grand piano where his mother played Chopin on Sunday afternoons, before disappearing one September morning without a trace. His father's study, with that persistent smell of Cuban cigars and burned papers. The guest room where he slept alone throughout his adolescence, fleeing from the nightmares that visited him in the main bedroom. Ethan Wellington never knew what it was to have a home. He grew up among employees who whispered in corridors and visitors who spoke in code. His childhood was a succession of private tutors, etiquette lessons, and formal dinners, where silence was more present than any conversation. When his mother disappeared, officially by suicide, he was 8 years old and already knew that some questions shouldn't be asked. His father, a brutal magnate who built a real estate empire on foundations of corruption and shadowy deals, died in a psychiatric hospital cell when Ethan turned 23, leaving him not only a fortune, but also a legacy of hushed scandals and confidentiality agreements. At 38, Ethan controlled everything except his own emptiness. The newspapers called him the invisible heir, discreet, mysterious, surrounded by rumors about hired lovers and undisclosed settlements with former female employees. His love life was an arid territory, populated by women who approached him for money and distanced themselves due to his coldness. He didn't blame them. He knew there was something broken in him, something that prevented him from truly connecting with anyone. The infertility, diagnosed after a motorcycle accident that nearly left him paraplegic at 25, was more than a physical impossibility. It was an emotional sentence: no heirs, no continuation, no legacy. For years he consulted the best specialists, underwent experimental treatments, but the result was always the same: impossible. The irony didn't escape him. Heir to an empire without the ability to produce heirs. To keep up appearances and stifle the silence consuming the mansion, he adopted Michael, the orphaned son of a distant cousin who died in a car accident. The 5-year-old boy brought a little life to those walls, but also highlighted Ethan's loneliness. He didn't know how to be a father, didn't know how to play, didn't know how to deal with a child's spontaneity. It was then that he decided to hire a nanny. Sarah Reynolds wasn't the typical woman he would hire. At 32, her face was marked by a subtle beauty, but her eyes revealed a strength that drew attention. A trained elementary school teacher, she had left the education system after reporting abuses at a private school, a school that, she later discovered, was discreetly financed by Wellington Construction. The complaint cost her her career. After fleeing from an abusive ex-husband and starting over from scratch, she accepted the job at the mansion out of desperation, but also for a reason she didn't reveal in the interview. On her first day of work, Sarah observed every detail of the house with eyes that seemed to catalogue information. Ethan noticed. There was something about her that bothered and attracted him at the same time, a silent determination that made him feel as if he were being studied, dissected. During the first few weeks, she maintained a professional distance, but he noticed that her eyes followed him when she thought he wasn't looking. The tension between them grew like ivy suffocating a statue. He tested her limits with prolonged glances, purposely ambiguous orders, and gestures that crossed the line between provocation and possessiveness. She resisted, but there was something about this broken man that awakened a secret identification in her, as if on some level she recognized the same pain that consumed her. And then, on a stormy night like that one, everything changed. The winter garden was the only place in the mansion where Ethan allowed himself to be vulnerable. Located at the back of the property, the glass greenhouse sheltered the dried flowers his mother had cultivated before disappearing. Dead lavender, roses that never bloomed again, jasmine that had become mere dry branches, a perfumed cemetery of memories that he could neither bury nor resurrect. Sarah found him there on that stormy night, 3 months after she started working at the house. Michael had been asleep for hours, and she should have retired to her quarters on the second floor, but something pulled her toward the faint light emanating from the greenhouse. Perhaps it was curiosity about the man who spoke little, but whose silence screamed. Or perhaps it was the need to understand why, with each passing day, she felt more connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. "You shouldn't be here," said Ethan, without turning around when he heard her footsteps on the stone floor. He had his back to her, his hands gently touching a lavender seedling that insisted on remaining dry despite all his care. "Neither should you," Sarah replied, approaching slowly. "It's 2 in the morning." He laughed, a low sound without humor. "This is my house. I can be wherever I want." "Your house," she repeated, looking around, "but not your home." Her words cut through the air like a blade. Ethan turned, and for the first time since they met, she saw something beyond the mask of control he always wore. There was pain there, raw and exposed like an open wound. "What do you know about homes?" he asked, his voice lower than normal. Sarah swallowed hard. She knew more than he imagined. She knew about houses that felt like prisons, about silences that suffocated, about secrets that corroded families from within. But she also knew about the real reason why she was there, and that made everything more complicated. "I know that a home isn't made of marble and crystal," she said, moving closer. "I know that you can have everything and still be empty." His gaze intensified. "And you, what makes you empty, Sarah?" She hesitated. How could she explain that her entire life had been a succession of escapes? From her alcoholic father, from her violent husband, from her career destroyed by trying to do the right thing. How could she say that she had accepted this job not just for money, but because she needed to understand the man behind the scandals that had destroyed so many lives? "Choices," she finally answered. "Choices I made, and that made me." The rain increased in intensity, beating against the greenhouse glass with renewed force. Thunder echoed in the sky, and for a moment the light flickered. In the momentary darkness, Ethan moved closer to her, and when the light returned they were so close that she could feel the heat emanating from his body. "You're dangerous," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "So are you," she replied, but she didn't move away. He raised his hand, touched her face with trembling fingers. "I'm not a good man, Sarah. I'm the son of a monster, heir to an empire built on others' pain. You should run from me." "I've already tried," she admitted, closing her eyes at his touch. "But you won't let me go." "Because I'm selfish," he said, bringing his face closer to hers. "Because in 3 months you've brought more life to this house than I've managed in 15 years. "Ethan, I know you hate me," he continued, interrupting her. "I know you have reasons for that. I know that the school where you reported the abuses was funded by my company. I know your career was destroyed because of men like me." Sarah opened her eyes, surprised. "You knew?" "I always know," he replied, but his voice didn't have its usual coldness. "I investigate everyone who enters my life, but with you it was different. It wasn't just precaution, it was obsession." Her heart raced. "Why?" "Because you look at me as if you could save me," he said, his voice breaking. "And I don't deserve to be saved." Before she could respond, his lips touched hers. It wasn't a soft or romantic kiss. It was desperate, hungry, like the kiss of a drowning man who had found air in another person's lungs. Sarah should have resisted, should have pulled away, but something inside her surrendered completely. When they separated, both were breathing heavily. Tears were rolling down her face, and he didn't know if they were from pleasure or regret. This destroyed him inside. "I'm sorry," he murmured, trying to pull away, but she held his face with both hands. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "Don't apologize, not now." And there, among the shards of glass and the warm scent of dead lavender, they gave themselves to each other like people trying to erase their own past with the other's mouth. Morning arrived with a grey light filtering through the curtains of Sarah's bedroom. She woke up alone, her body still marked by the intensity of the previous night, but with an emptiness in her chest that she couldn't explain. Ethan had left before dawn, leaving only the scent of his cologne on the pillow and a feeling of incompleteness that consumed her. During the following weeks, he went back to being the distant and controlled man she had met on the first day. He spoke to her only when necessary about Michael, avoided eye contact, maintained a physical distance that seemed calculated to the centimeter. But Sarah noticed the tension in his shoulders when she passed nearby, the way his hands trembled imperceptibly when he had to hand her a document, the way his breathing changed when they were in the same room. Guilt consumed him. Ethan knew he had crossed a line that should not have been crossed. Sarah was his employee, a woman who had already been hurt by powerful men, and he had taken advantage of a moment of vulnerability to satisfy a desire that had been growing for months. He considered that night a necessary mistake, a sensual distraction in a daily life of emotional concrete, but he couldn't erase from his memory the taste of her lips, the sound of the sighs that escaped her mouth, the way she had given herself completely, despite all the reasons to resist. Sarah, in turn, felt divided between anger and a longing that made no sense. She had accepted the job at the mansion with a specific goal: to discreetly investigate the man behind the funds that silenced the victims of the past. She knew about the obscure connections of Wellington Construction with fertility clinics, about the confidentiality agreements that hushed up scandals, about the women who were harmed and then bought off with dirty money. But knowing Ethan personally had complicated everything. He wasn't the monster she had imagined. He was a haunted man, carrying the weight of decisions he hadn't made and secrets he hadn't created. This didn't absolve him, but it made everything more complex. And that night in the greenhouse had revealed a vulnerability in him that had deeply touched her. One afternoon, while Michael was playing in the garden, Sarah decided to confront him. She found Ethan in his study, bent over a pile of contracts, his forehead furrowed in concentration. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. He looked up, and for a moment the mask of indifference almost fell. About what? About what happened. About what's happening between us. "Nothing is happening," he replied, returning his attention to the papers. "It was a mistake. It won't happen again." A mistake. Her voice had a hardness that made him look up again. "Is that how you refer to all the women who pass through your life?" Ethan stood up, coming around the desk to face her. "You're not like the other women who have passed through my life." "Then why are you treating me like I am?" He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had already learned to recognize. "Because it's easier. Because if I admit that night meant something, I'll have to admit that you affect me in a way that shouldn't be possible. And what's wrong with that?" "Everything," he replied, his voice filled with bitterness. "I'm sterile, Sarah. I can't give you children. I can't give you a future. I'm a broken man carrying the weight of crimes I didn't commit, but for which I'm responsible by inheritance." She approached, placing her hand on his chest. "I didn't ask for children. I didn't ask for a future. I only asked that you stop running." "I'm not running," he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. "Yes, you are. Just like I am." Her confession caught him off guard. "What are you running from?" Sarah hesitated. It was the perfect opportunity to tell the truth, to reveal the real reasons that brought her there. But looking into his eyes, seeing the genuine pain he carried, she couldn't do it. Not yet. "From feeling," she finally said. "From allowing myself to feel something for someone who could hurt me." "I will hurt you," he said, touching her face. "It's inevitable. I hurt all the people who get close to me. And if I'm willing to take the risk?" For a moment he seemed to consider the possibility. Then, as if waking from a trance, he abruptly pulled away. "No," he said, going back behind the desk. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me." "That choice isn't yours," she replied, her voice firm. "It's mine." He didn't respond, but Sarah saw the conflict stamped on his face. She knew she had planted a seed, that the conversation had changed something between them. But she also knew that Ethan was a man accustomed to controlling everything around him, and losing control over his own feelings was something that terrified him. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. She could no longer pretend she felt nothing, could no longer live in the constant tension of that almost relationship. Either they would face what was between them, or she would leave. But fate had other plans, because 3 weeks later, when she finally gathered the courage to give an ultimatum, she discovered something that would make any escape impossible. She was pregnant. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom sink for almost an hour before Sarah could look at it again. Two clear, unquestionable lines that changed her entire reality. Sitting on the edge of the bathtub with trembling hands, she tried to process what it meant. Ethan had been clear about his condition. Sterile, unable to father children. He himself had said it, with the bitterness of someone carrying a definitive sentence. So how was it possible? How could she be pregnant by a man who couldn't impregnate anyone? The possibilities that passed through her mind frightened her. Perhaps the doctors had been wrong. Perhaps his sterility wasn't complete. Or perhaps there was something she didn't know, something that even he didn't know. During the following days, Sarah lived in a state of constant anxiety. She observed Ethan with new eyes, looking for signs, clues, anything that could explain the impossible. He remained distant, but she noticed that something had changed since the conversation in the study. There was a restlessness in him, a tension that went beyond the situation between them. What she didn't know was that Ethan was also struggling with disturbing discoveries. Some documents found in his father's personal archive had awakened suspicions he preferred not to explore. Papers about experimental treatments, contracts with fertility clinics, signatures he didn't recognize but that carried his name. On Thursday of the third week, Sarah finally took courage. She couldn't keep the secret anymore, couldn't pretend that everything was normal. She found Ethan in the garden, watching Michael play with a paper airplane. "Ethan," she began, her voice more trembling than she would have liked. "I need to tell you something." He turned, and something in her expression must have betrayed the seriousness of the situation, because his face immediately hardened. "What is it?" I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at her for long seconds, as if trying to process words spoken in a foreign language. Then slowly, his expression changed from confusion to something she couldn't decipher. "Impossible," he finally said, his voice low but firm. "I thought so too," she replied, taking the pregnancy test from her purse. "But it's not." He took the object with hands that trembled imperceptibly, studied the two lines as if he could make them disappear just by looking. "This isn't mine," he said, returning the test to her. "It can't be." The words cut Sarah like a blade. "How can you be sure?" "Because I'm sterile," he replied, his voice carrying a coldness she hadn't expected. "You know that." "I told you." "So what exactly are you accusing me of?" Ethan ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his nervousness despite his apparent calm. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying that this child can't be mine." "You're the only man I've been with," said Sarah, struggling to keep her voice steady. "For the last 2 years, you're the only one." "Then perhaps we should discover how this is possible," he replied, but there was something in his tone that sounded forced, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. Sarah felt her heart shatter. This wasn't how she had imagined the conversation. She expected shock, surprise, maybe even anger, but not this calculated coldness, this refusal to accept even the possibility. "Do you really believe I would lie about this?" "I believe you could be mistaken," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Or that there could be other explanations." "What other explanations?" "I don't know," he admitted, and for the first time since the beginning of the conversation his voice faltered. "But I know I can't be the father of this child." Sarah swallowed the tears that threatened to fall. "Then I guess we have nothing more to talk about." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Sarah, wait." She stopped but didn't turn around. "What?" He hesitated as if he were fighting against himself. "I need time to process this, to understand what's happening." "Time?" She turned, and he saw that she was crying. "Ethan, I don't have time. I'm pregnant, alone, not knowing how I'm going to support a child. I need answers, not more time." "Then let's do a test," he said, his voice softer. "Let's find out the truth." Sarah nodded, but something had broken between them. The coldness of his initial reaction, the refusal to accept even the possibility, had created a crack that she didn't know if it could be repaired. "All right," she said. "Let's do the test." But deep in her heart, she already knew that regardless of the result, nothing would be the same again. Because for the first time since they met, she had seen Ethan not as a haunted man who needed salvation, but as a man who, faced with the first real difficulty, had chosen to doubt her instead of trust. And that hurt more than any rejection. The private laboratory was in a discreet building in Williamsburg, the kind of place where people with money resolved delicate matters away from curious eyes. Ethan had personally chosen it, ensuring total confidentiality and results within 48 hours. Sarah accompanied him in silence, the distance between them in the back seat of the car seeming greater than miles. During the journey, she observed his profile. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the window, his jaw tense, his hands closed into fists on his legs. There was something beyond doubt in his posture, a restlessness that she couldn't decipher. It was as if he were fighting against some discovery he preferred not to make. "Are you okay?" she asked, breaking the silence. "No," he replied, without taking his eyes off the window. "None of this should be happening." "But it is happening," said Sarah, placing her hand on her still flat stomach. "And running from reality won't change that." Ethan finally looked at her, and Sarah saw something that surprised her. Fear. Not anger, not coldness, but a pure and primitive fear that he tried to hide behind the mask of control. "I'm afraid," he admitted, his voice low. "Afraid that it's true. Afraid that it's not. Afraid of what it means either way." "Why are you afraid it might be true?" "Because it would change everything," he replied. "Because it would mean that everything I believed about myself was a lie. Because it would mean that maybe I'm not the sterile and broken man I thought I was all these years." Sarah felt her heart tighten. "And would that be bad?" "It would be complicated," he said, finally looking directly at her. "Very complicated." The test was quick and clinical. Blood collection, some basic questions, document signing. Ethan remained by her side throughout the process, a silent but constant presence. When they finished, he accompanied her home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The next 2 days were torture. Sarah tried to maintain a normal routine with Michael, but the tension was palpable. Ethan locked himself in his study, coming out only for meals, where he barely touched his food. She could hear him walking the corridors during the early hours, a restless soul that couldn't find peace. On Friday afternoon, the phone call came. Ethan answered personally, his monosyllabic responses revealing nothing. When he hung up, he remained seated behind the desk for long minutes, his face as pale as paper. Sarah entered the study without knocking, her heart racing. "Well?" "Perfect compatibility," he said, his voice strangely empty. "The child is mine." The relief she expected to feel didn't come. Instead, a strange sensation invaded her as she saw his expression, not joy, not anger, but a kind of profound shock. "Ethan, I don't understand," he murmured, picking up some papers on the desk. "I don't understand how this is possible. Maybe the doctors were wrong about your condition," she suggested, approaching. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It wasn't a mistake. I saw the tests. I did several over the years. I am sterile, Sarah, or at least I was." "Then how—" "That's what I need to find out," he replied, rising abruptly. "I need to understand what happened. I need to reread all the documents, talk to the doctors, investigate." "Ethan, stop," she said, holding his arm. "You're in shock. Maybe we should just accept that this happened and move forward." "Move forward?" He stared at her with eyes that seemed to burn. "You don't understand. If I can have children, if I always could, it means that someone lied to me. It means that someone deceived me for 15 years. The intensity in his voice frightened her. "What difference does that make now?" "All the difference," he replied, pulling away. "All the damn difference." Sarah felt a chill in her stomach. There was something more behind his reaction, something she wasn't seeing. "What aren't you telling me?" Ethan hesitated, the conflict visible on his face. "I found some documents in my father's archive. Contracts, agreements, papers I don't fully understand. But there are signatures with my name, authorizations for procedures I don't remember having done." "What kind of procedures?" "Experimental treatments, genetic material collections, confidentiality agreements." He ran his hand through his hair, the gesture increasingly nervous. "There are references to a fertility clinic that had connections with my father's company." Sarah's blood froze. Fertility clinic. The pieces of a puzzle she had been assembling for months began to fit together in a terrifying way. "What clinic?" "Regenerate Institute," he replied, and the name hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. "Do you know it?" She knew it. She knew it very well. It was the same clinic that had destroyed the lives of dozens of women, the same one that had conducted unauthorized experiments, the same one that had motivated her secret investigation. And now she discovered that Ethan had also been a victim of it. "Sarah." His voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" She wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. Because suddenly she understood that her pregnancy might not be the miracle she had imagined. Perhaps it was part of something much bigger, much darker, and much more dangerous than either of them could imagine. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "About why I really came to work here." The silence that followed Sarah's words was dense as lead. Ethan stared at her for long seconds, as if trying to decipher a riddle he didn't want to solve. There was something in his gaze that she had never seen before, a mixture of betrayal and understanding that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "So you lied," he finally said, his voice low but carrying a coldness that cut through the air. "From the first day you lied to me." "I didn't lie," Sarah replied, trying to stay calm. "I omitted. There's a difference." "Is there?" Ethan moved away from her, putting the desk between them like a barrier. "You entered my house, took care of my son, slept in my bed knowing you had a secret agenda. What do you call that?" "I call it trying to discover the truth," she said, her voice gaining firmness. "I call it trying to do justice for the women who were harmed by this clinic." "What women?" Sarah took a deep breath. It was time to tell everything. Dozens of them. Women who sought the Regenerate Institute for fertility treatments and were subjected to experimental procedures without consent. Women who became pregnant with genetic material that wasn't from their husbands. Women who were threatened, bought off, silenced. Ethan's face paled. "And you believe I was involved in this?" "At first, yes," she admitted. Wellington Construction discreetly funded several clinics, including the Regenerate Institute. When my career was destroyed for reporting a school linked to your company, I wanted to understand who was behind it. I wanted to find evidence. And did you find it?" "I found something very different from what I expected," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "I found you. A man who wasn't the monster I imagined, but another victim." Ethan laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Victim? I'm the heir to all this. I'm responsible for every crime, every dirty deal, every life destroyed." "You were 17 when the clinic was closed," said Sarah, approaching again. "You were a minor when most of the crimes were committed. How can you be responsible?" "Because I inherited everything," he replied, hitting his fist on the desk. "Because I used the money that came from these crimes. Because I live in the house built with others suffering. And now you have the chance to do differently," she said, placing her hand over his. "Now you can use that money to repair what was done." Ethan stared at her, and for the first time since the conversation began, his expression softened. "You really believe I can be different?" "I wouldn't have fallen in love with you if I didn't believe it," she replied, and the words came out before she could stop them. The impact of the confession was visible on his face. "You fell in love with me." "Despite all the reasons not to fall in love," she said, tears finally escaping. "Despite knowing who you are, where your money comes from, all the secrets you carry. Yes, I fell in love with you." Ethan came around the desk, stopping only when he was close enough to touch her face. "Even knowing that I might be part of all this, even knowing that maybe this pregnancy is the result of some experiment my father funded?" "Did you hear what you just said?" she asked, covering his hand with hers. "You said it might be the result of experiments your father funded. Not you. Your father. But I carried his name, I benefited from his crimes. And now you have the chance to carry his name differently," she said. "You can be the Wellington who builds instead of destroys, who protects instead of harms." Ethan closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm afraid," he murmured. "Afraid of not being able to be the man you deserve. Afraid that this child will grow up hating their own surname as I did." "Then let's give her reasons to be proud of it," said Sarah, placing her hand on her stomach. "Let's build something new, something clean, something that honors the victims instead of hiding them." "How?" "First, by discovering the whole truth," she replied. "We need to understand exactly what happened to you, how you could have gotten someone pregnant while supposedly being sterile. We need to find out what really happened at that clinic." Ethan nodded, but there was apprehension in his eyes. "And if we discover things we don't want to know, then we'll face them together," she said, intertwining her fingers with his. "But we can't build a future on lies from the past." "Together?" he asked, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that touched her deeply. "If you'll have me," she replied. "If you can forgive me for having lied about the reasons why I came to work here. Do you forgive me for having doubted you when I learned about the pregnancy?" "I already have," she said, smiling for the first time in days. "Because I understood that your reaction wasn't about me. It was about the fear of discovering that your entire life was built on a lie." Ethan kissed her then, a kiss different from the one they had shared in the greenhouse. It wasn't desperate or hungry. It was a silent promise, a commitment to face together whatever lay ahead. When they separated, he held her face between his hands. "I fell in love with you too," he said, "from the first day you entered this house and looked at me as if you could see through all the masks I wear." "And what did you see when you looked at me?" "Hope," he replied. "For the first time in 15 years, I saw hope." But both knew that hope, by itself, would not be enough, because the secrets they were about to discover would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. The investigation began in the basement of the mansion, in an archive that Ethan had never fully explored. Boxes and boxes of dusty documents, old contracts, yellowed photographs, and papers that his father had left in a state of apparent disorganization, but which followed a sinister logic that only revealed itself when they began to organize them chronologically. Sarah worked alongside Ethan for 3 days, both immersed in a reality that became more frightening with each discovered document. The Regenerate Institute wasn't just a fertility clinic. It was a genetic experiment laboratory, funded by several companies, including Wellington Construction, with the aim of creating genetically superior lineages for wealthy families. "Look at this," said Sarah, raising a document that made her blood freeze. Temporary sterilization contract signed by William Wellington on behalf of the minor Ethan Wellington, age 17. Reversible procedure upon paternal authorization. Ethan took the paper with trembling hands. "Temporary sterilization, is that possible?" "Apparently, yes," she replied, leafing through other documents. "There are records here of experimental procedures that blocked male fertility using hormonal implants. Implants that could be removed or neutralized when convenient. Why would my father do this to me?" "Control," said Sarah, finding more evidence. "Your father wanted to control when and how you would have children. He wanted to ensure that the Wellington heirs would be genetically planned, not the result of casual relationships." The reality unfolded before them like a horror movie. Ethan's father had subjected his own son to an experimental procedure at 17, implanting devices that blocked his fertility. At the same time, he collected and stored Ethan's genetic material for future use in an assisted reproduction program that selected specific women to generate ideal heirs. "There's a list," said Ethan, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "A list of women who were selected." Sarah looked over his shoulder and saw dozens of names, ages, professions, detailed psychological profiles. Young women, intelligent, in good health, most in financially vulnerable situations. Teachers, nurses, college students, she murmured, scanning the list. "All with similar profiles. All like you," Ethan completed, looking at her with an expression that mixed horror and understanding. The silence that followed was disturbing. Sarah felt the world spinning around her, the pieces of the puzzle fitting together in a terrifying way. Her pregnancy wasn't a miracle. It was the result of a plan orchestrated by a dead man, executed by a clinic she had spent months investigating. "I need air," she said, rising abruptly and climbing the stairs. Ethan followed her, finding her in the garden, bent over herself, fighting against nausea that they didn't know if it was from the pregnancy or the revelation. "Sarah," he said, approaching cautiously. "Breathe. Just breathe." "I was used," she said, the words coming out broken. "We were used. This child. It's not the fruit of love. It's the fruit of an experiment." "No," said Ethan, kneeling beside her. "Don't say that. What happened between us that night was real. What we felt was real. But the pregnancy wasn't natural," she said, looking at him with eyes full of tears. "I was manipulated to be here, to get close to you, to..." "To what?" he asked, holding her hands. "You yourself said you came here to investigate me, to find evidence against me. You weren't manipulated by anyone." "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "I don't know what's real anymore and what's part of some macabre plan." Ethan pulled her into his arms, feeling her body tremble. "I know what's real," he said, his voice firm. "What I feel for you is real. What you feel for me is real. And this child, regardless of how it was conceived, is ours. How can you be sure? Because I choose to believe, he replied, pulling back to look into her eyes. Because if we start to doubt everything, if we let my father's crimes contaminate even our feelings, then he will have won. Even dead, he will have managed to destroy the only good thing that happened in my life. Sarah stared at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. And if we discover there's more, and if we discover there are still people involved in this, then we'll go after them, he said, standing up and extending his hand to her. We'll expose everything. We'll ensure that no other woman goes through this. It won't be easy, she said, accepting his hand. There are powerful people involved, people who would kill to keep this secret. I know, he replied, helping her to stand. But for the first time in my life, I have something worth fighting for. They returned to the house, determined to continue the investigation. But neither of them was prepared for what they would discover the next day, that the Regenerate Institute had been secretly reopened, that the assisted reproduction program was still functioning, and that Sarah wasn't the only woman who had been selected recently. Worse still, they would discover that someone knew about the investigation they were conducting, and that this person was willing to do anything to protect the secrets they were unearthing. The next morning, Sarah woke up with contractions. She was only 6 months pregnant, but her body was rejecting the pregnancy. When Ethan found her in the bathroom, pale and bleeding, he knew that the battle for truth had become a battle for life. "Call an ambulance," she said, her voice weak. "Something's wrong." And as they rushed to the hospital, neither of them knew that they were being followed by men who had received orders to ensure that neither the mother nor the child would survive to tell the truth. Mount Sinai Hospital was immersed in the silence of the early morning when Ethan carried Sarah through the corridors, her cries of pain echoing off the white walls. Blood stained her dress, and the panic in her eyes was something he would never forget. For 48 hours she remained between life and death, while doctors fought to save both the mother and the child. There were complications, explained Dr. Miller, the family's obstetrician for decades. Premature detachment of the placenta, severe hemorrhaging. We managed to stabilize the situation, but she will have to remain on absolute bed rest for the next 3 months. Ethan didn't leave her side during the entire hospitalization. He slept in the armchair next to the bed, refused to go home, cancelled all his meetings. For the first time in his life, something was more important than business, more important than control, more important than the company itself. "You need to go home," said Sarah on the third night, her voice still weak but determined. "Michael needs you. The company needs you." "They can wait," he replied, holding her hand. "You're more important." "Ethan," she said, forcing a smile, "I'm not going to die, but you need to take care of your life." "My life is here," he said, kissing her hand. "My life is you and this child." It was during one of his absences to take a shower that Sarah received the unexpected visit. An elegant woman, about 50 years old, entered the room without knocking and closed the door behind her. "You must be Sarah," said the stranger, approaching the bed. "I'm Helen Wellington, William's sister-in-law." Sarah felt her blood freeze. Helen was a name that had appeared in the documents, always associated with the darker aspects of the family business. "What do you want?" "To talk," replied Helen, sitting in the chair where Ethan had spent the last few days. "About the future. About what will happen to you and this child. I have nothing to talk about with you." "Yes, you do," said Helen, removing an envelope from her purse, "especially after you know what really happened to you." Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, documents, medical exams she had never seen. "You were drugged," said Helen, observing her reaction. "That night in the greenhouse. Ethan doesn't know, of course. He believes it was a spontaneous, even romantic moment. But the truth is that you were medicated with fertility hormones weeks before. Your body was prepared for that night." "That's impossible," murmured Sarah, but her hands trembled as she looked at the documents. "Do you really believe it was coincidence? A woman investigating our family gets a job in the house, seduces the heir on the exact night she was ovulating, and gets pregnant by a supposedly sterile man. Who did this?" "People who wanted the program to continue," replied Helen. "People who knew that Ethan would never consciously agree, but who needed heirs to maintain control of the company." "And are you one of those people?" Helen smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm the person who's trying to save you. Because if you don't do what I'm about to ask, both you and your child will die." What kind of threat is that? It's not a threat, said Helen, rising. It's reality. There are people willing to kill to keep the secrets buried, people who have already tried to cause your miscarriage by inducing the complications you had. Sarah felt the world spin around her. The contractions, they were caused. Medication introduced into your food, confirmed Helen. Lucky for you that Ethan brought you here in time, but next time you might not be so lucky. What do you want from me? For you to disappear, said Helen, placing another envelope on the table. There's enough money for you to live comfortably anywhere in the world. Change your name, change your country. Have the child far from here. Let Ethan believe you died in childbirth. Never, said Sarah, her voice gaining strength. I'll never abandon him. Then you'll kill him, replied Helen. Because if you stay here, if you continue investigating, if you continue unearthing the past, he'll be the next to die. Who's behind this? People who have a lot to lose, said Helen, walking toward the door. People who built empires on the experiments you're discovering. People who won't hesitate to eliminate any threat. And you? I'm a woman who lost her husband because he tried to expose the truth, replied Helen, stopping at the door. I'm a woman who doesn't want to see the same happen to Ethan. When Helen left, Sarah remained silent for long minutes, holding the envelopes and trying to process what she had heard. Everything she believed about her story with Ethan was a lie. She had been manipulated, drugged, used as a breeder in a plan she never imagined existed. When Ethan returned, she was crying silently. What happened? He asked, rushing to her side. Nothing, she lied, hiding the envelopes. Just pregnancy hormones. But as he consoled her, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't disappear. But she also wouldn't put Ethan's life at risk. There was a third option, one neither of them imagined. She would fake her own death and discover who was really behind it all. And then, when she had all the answers, she would return to destroy those who had destroyed so many lives. What she didn't know was that Ethan had heard part of the conversation through the door and was also planning something that would put them both in even greater danger, but that would finally reveal the whole truth. Ethan couldn't sleep. For the 3 nights following Helen's visit, he remained awake, pretending to rest in the armchair while observing Sarah. Something had changed in her after that afternoon. There was a tension in her shoulders, a distance in her eyes that he couldn't decipher, and there was fear. A fear she tried to hide, but that he recognized because it was the same he felt. On the 4th night, she finally spoke. Ethan, she said, her voice low in the darkness of the room. I need you to promise me something. Anything, he replied, approaching the bed. If something happens to me, if I die in childbirth, or if something goes wrong, I need you to protect our daughter. Don't let her grow up in this world of secrets and lies. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said, but there was a hopelessness in his voice that he couldn't hide. Promise, she insisted, holding his hand tightly. Promise that you'll take her away from here, that you'll raise her far from all this. I promise, he said, but as the words left his mouth, he already knew he wouldn't fulfill them, because he wouldn't run. He wouldn't let those responsible for all that manipulation remain free. The next day, while Sarah was sleeping, Ethan received a call that confirmed his worst fears. It was the private detective he had hired to investigate the Regenerate Institute. Mr. Wellington, said the voice on the other end of the line. I found something you need to see personally. What is it? The institute wasn't closed, it was transferred. It's now operating at a private clinic in Miami Beach under the name Advanced Reproductive Medicine Center. And there's a client list, a list that includes names you'll recognize. Ethan felt his blood freeze. What kind of names? Politicians, businessmen, judges, people who can protect the operation, and Mr. Wellington, and there's something else. Your wife wasn't the only woman selected recently. There are 3 others, all pregnant, all unaware they were manipulated. Where are these women? 2 disappeared. 1 died from complications in childbirth. The fourth what? The 4th is the woman who sought you out at the hospital, Helen Wellington. She's not your aunt, sir. She's one of the victims who managed to discover the truth. Ethan's world collapsed. Helen had lied about her identity, but perhaps she hadn't lied about the danger. He needed to find her, needed to understand what was really happening. Where can I find her? Address in your email, said the detective. But, Mr. Wellington, be careful. The people behind this won't hesitate to kill to keep the secrets. Ethan hung up and looked at Sarah, who was still sleeping peacefully. For a moment, he considered waking her, telling her everything, facing the situation together. But then he remembered the fear in her eyes, the contractions that had almost killed her, the blood that had stained her dress. He couldn't put her in more danger. He left a note on the bedside table, a lie about an urgent meeting at the company, and left the hospital. The address led him to a small apartment in Upper East Side, where he found Helen waiting for him. "I knew you would come," she said, opening the door before he even knocked. "Who are you really?" "My name is Helen Sanders," she replied, inviting him in. "I was a biology teacher until 5 years ago, when I was selected for the program. I became pregnant by a man I never saw, gave birth to a child who was taken from me at birth. And after that, I tried to report it, tried to expose the truth. My husband supported me, helped with the investigation. He died in a car accident 3 days before we delivered the evidence to the press." Ethan felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. "What did they do with your son?" "Daughter," corrected Helen, her eyes filling with tears. "She was adopted by a family abroad. I never saw her again, never knew her name." "Why did you seek me out? Why did you threaten Sarah?" "Because I don't want her to go through what I went through," replied Helen, rising and walking to the window. "Because there are people willing to kill to keep this secret, and you're very close to the truth." "Who are these people?" "Dr. Richard Miller, the obstetrician who's caring for your wife. He's one of the program coordinators. Senator Thompson, who provides political protection, and Mark Wellington, your cousin. He didn't die in the car accident like everyone believes. He's alive, coordinating the entire operation." The shock was like a punch to the stomach. Mark, the cousin he considered dead for 5 years, was alive and behind all this. "Where is he?" "At the clinic in Miami, controlling everything. He found out you were investigating. He was the one who ordered them to cause Sarah's miscarriage." Ethan stood up, anger taking over his body. "I'll kill him." "No," said Helen, holding his arm. "He's expecting that. He has armed men. He has protection. If you go there, you'll die." "Then what do you suggest?" "That we do what he doesn't expect," she replied, picking up a file from the table. "That we expose everything publicly. That we deliver all the evidence to the press at the same time. That we make it impossible for them to silence the truth." "And Sarah?" "Sarah needs to disappear until this is over. She needs to be protected. She'll never agree." "Then don't give her a choice," said Helen, handing him a vial of medicine. "Induce labor. Bring the child to a safe place. Keep Sarah sedated until it's all over." Ethan looked at the vial, the internal conflict tearing his chest. "That's betrayal." "That's protection," replied Helen. "It's love." And as he returned to the hospital, Ethan knew he was about to make the most difficult decision of his life, a decision that could save Sarah and their daughter, but that could also forever destroy the trust between them. What he didn't know was that Sarah had woken up, read the note he had left, and discovered that it wasn't about a meeting at the company. It was about her, and now she too was making a decision that would change everything. When Ethan returned to the hospital that night, he found the room empty. Sarah had disappeared, leaving only a note on the pillow. "Trust me. I'll be back." The panic that seized him was like nothing he had ever felt. He ran through the corridors, interrogated nurses, threatened doctors, but no one had seen anything. She had simply disappeared. What he didn't know was that Sarah had discovered the truth about Helen through Dr. Miller himself. In a desperate attempt to protect the operation, the doctor had told her everything. Helen wasn't a victim trying to help, but one of the program's coordinators who had infiltrated their lives to control the situation. Her supposedly dead husband had never existed, and her lost daughter was an elaborate lie to gain Ethan's trust. Sarah had fled the hospital not to hide, but to confront the real enemy. 8 months pregnant with constant pain and intermittent bleeding, she traveled to Miami to find Mark Wellington at the clinic where it had all begun. The Advanced Reproductive Medicine Center occupied a modern building in Miami Beach, its glass facades reflecting a sky that was beginning to darken. Sarah managed to get in by pretending to be a patient in labor and was taken directly to the floor where Mark maintained his office. "Welcome," he said when she entered, as if he had been expecting her. "I thought you'd never come." Mark Wellington at 42 was the perverse version of Ethan. He had the same dark eyes, the same facial structure. But where Ethan carried melancholy, Mark exhibited a calculating coldness that made one's blood freeze. "You destroyed the lives of dozens of women," said Sarah, her voice carrying an anger she had never felt. "You turned my pregnancy into a laboratory experiment. I turned your pregnancy into a miracle," he replied, rising from his chair. "I gave you the chance to carry the child of a man you love. Without my intervention, you would never have this child. With lies, with manipulation, with drugs." "With science," corrected Mark, approaching her. "Your feelings for Ethan are real. His for you too. I merely facilitated what already existed." "And the other women? Those who died? Those who had their children stolen?" "Necessary sacrifices," he said, showing no remorse. "Some experiments work, others don't. But all contribute to the advancement of science." "You're a monster." "I'm a visionary," he replied, stopping right in front of her. "And you, my dear, are proof that my work functions. Your daughter will be born with superior genes, with above-average intelligence, with enhanced physical characteristics. She will be the future of humanity." Sarah felt a strong contraction and bent over in pain. The bleeding had increased during the trip, and she knew she was going into premature labor. "Perfect," said Mark, noticing her condition. "You came here to die and give birth at the same time. How poetic." "I'm not going to die," she said, fighting against the pain. "And you're not going to touch my daughter." "I already have," he replied, showing a vial of medication. "The drugs you took throughout the pregnancy weren't just to ensure conception. They were to condition the child to my DNA, to make her dependent on treatments that only I can provide. That's impossible." "It's advanced genetics," he said, injecting the contents of the vial into a syringe. "Your daughter will need regular medication to survive. Medication that only I can produce. She will be mine forever." Sarah tried to run, but another contraction brought her down. The bleeding had intensified, and she knew she was losing a lot of blood. But when Mark approached with the syringe, she found strength she didn't know she had. "You're not going to touch her," she said, grabbing a scalpel from the medical table beside her. "I'll kill you first." "You don't have the courage," he said, continuing to approach. Sarah didn't hesitate. When he was a few inches from her, she plunged the scalpel into his neck. Mark fell, his eyes wide with surprise, blood spurting between the fingers that tried to stop the wound. You killed the future," he murmured, before passing out. Sarah didn't have time to check if he was dead. The contractions had intensified, and she knew her daughter was coming. Using the office phone, she called Ethan. "Sarah, where are you?" "Miami," she said, her voice weak. "Beach clinic. I'm having the baby." "I'm coming right now," he said, and she could hear the desperation in his voice. "Ethan," she said, feeling that she was losing consciousness. "I found out everything. About Mark, about Helen, about the experiments. It's all recorded on my phone." "Sarah, don't talk. Conserve your strength." "I love you," she murmured before fainting. Ethan arrived 3 hours later, accompanied by an emergency medical team and federal agents. He found Sarah unconscious in an improvised operating room with a newborn child in her arms. Mark was being treated by paramedics, alive but in critical condition. "She lost a lot of blood," said the doctor, "but she'll survive. The child was born healthy." Ethan held his daughter for the first time, looking at that perfect little face that was a mixture of him and Sarah. All the manipulations, all the experiments, all the lies couldn't change the fact that this child was theirs, born of love, not science. "What shall we call her?" asked Sarah when she finally woke up. "Hope," he replied, kissing her forehead. "We'll call her Hope." 6 months later they were married, living in a new house far from the Wellington mansion. Ethan had donated most of his fortune to a fund assisting victims of illegal medical experiments, keeping only enough to secure the family's future. The construction company was sold, and he dedicated himself entirely to a foundation that investigated and punished crimes against vulnerable women. Mark survived the injury, but was sentenced to life in prison. Helen was also arrested, revealing herself indeed to be one of the program's coordinators. Dr. Miller lost his medical license and was sued by dozens of victims. "Do you regret it?" asked Sarah one afternoon as they watched Hope play in the garden. "Regret what?" "Giving up everything. The company, the money, the power." Ethan looked at his wife, at his daughter. at the simple but honest life they had built. "Never," he said, pulling her in for a kiss. "For the first time in my life, I have a real home." And there, amid a child's laughter and promises of the future, they discovered that some love stories don't begin with promises. They begin with forgiveness, grow with truth, and become eternal through the daily choice to love despite everything.